Hey, Future Terry here. I know, it's been a pretty long time since I've uploaded anything. That's completely on me. I played way more Dragon's Dogma 2 than I originally intended, and by the time I got done recording the script and was ready to edit, I had to leave for a family trip. When I got back home, my brain was just stuck in vacation mode. I got distracted by a bunch of other stuff and procrastinated like crazy. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that you can consider this less of a first impressions video now and more like a full review. There might be a couple of inaccuracies here and there, but I tried to address those with on-screen text anytime I found them. So with that in mind, I hope you get all the info that you want out of the video, and please enjoy. Hello, I'm LegenTerry, and these are my first impressions of Dragon's Dogma II, an open-world action RPG developed and published by Capcom. 2024 has already had its fair share of awesome, lengthy RPGs vying for our attention. We've gotten Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, Persona 3 Reload, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Last Epoch, Unicorn Overlord, and probably more I can't think of off the top of my head. But by comparison, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a little strange. It doesn't really feel like the type of game that gets made anymore. It plays and acts very much in line with the way its predecessor did. I believe the appropriate term would be anachronistic. Around the time the first game came out on PS3 and Xbox 360, I was all in on Skyrim, as almost everyone else was. It had launched a few months prior to Dragon's Dogma, and I was so invested that I never bothered to check whether or not the grass was greener on the other side. It seemed that the answer from most players and reviewers was a resounding no, but there was a small vocal niche who really enjoyed it, which steadily grew into a cult following over the years. Dragon's Dogma 2 basically seems to be a reimagining of the first game in almost every aspect, a kind of soft reboot to implement the ideas and features they couldn't quite nail with the technology and budget limitations they once had. It's kind of like how From Software brought the Armored Core series out of dormancy last year. Sure, both series had their fans back in the day, but it never felt like these games had the chance to reach their full potential outside of Japan. A lot of people might have loved Resident Evil or Street Fighter on this side of the pond, but those successes didn't exactly translate to hyping up the masses to check out Capcom's weird RPG that played like a single-player MMO. But now that Capcom is firing on all cylinders with almost every new release, especially with series like Monster Hunter, which was equally as obscure in the West a few short years ago picking up steam, it's getting its second chance in the spotlight. The story of Dragon's Dogma 2 isn't exactly Shakespearean, though all the characters do speak in ye olde English. Recently, Capcom released a video narrated by Ian McShane which breaks down the finer details in the plot if you really care to dive that deep, but these are the basics that you need to know. The world is pretty much your standard fantasy setting full of magic and dangerous creatures. The two playable races, human and beastren, which are cat people, have the two largest kingdoms in the land. They're neighbors, but they aren't exactly happy about it. There's a giant dragon who terrorizes the world, and no matter which race you play as, you become what's called the Arisen. Essentially, you tried to fight the dragon, you lost, and the dragon decided to pluck your heart from your chest and swallow it whole. Then you came back to life with cool powers. This is set to happen once every generation, and now you have to go on a quest to try and reclaim your heart by slaying the dragon. Now, I didn't play the first game, but I do know that you also played an Arisen in it. But the dragon's still around, meaning that Arisen didn't kill it by the end of the game? I have no idea how this works out. Maybe both games are happening at the same time or in a parallel reality? And why would the dragon make you into dragon-slaying machines in the first place anyways? Seems kinda counterintuitive. Oh well, anyways, let's just set that aside for now. Being the Arisen comes with some perks. The people of the human kingdom, Vermund, consider the Arisen to be their sovereign ruler, and part of this is because a group known as the Legion of Pawns are wholly obedient to the Arisen. The Pawns' wills are swayed by the Arisen, and they feel that their sole purpose in life is to serve them. They look human, but really they're like a Mr. Meeseeks in human skin, and unlike the general populace, pawns are immortal. When they die, they return to a place called the Rift, a pocket of space that connects parallel versions of reality to one another. This makes pawns the perfect adventuring companions for the Arisen to fulfill their dragon hunting duties, hence the name, Dragon's Dogma. Well, in this game, you were the Arisen, for a very brief time. But then, somehow you got amnesia and wound up in a prison camp on the other side of the world. But after a Medusa shows up and starts petrifying and killing people, you take the opportunity to use it as a distraction and escape on the back of a griffin. It conveniently flies you all the way back to Vermund, where it gets shot down by a ballista, and the pawns there recognize your authority. But apparently an imposter Arisen has taken your throne at the capital, and somehow they also have the power to command pawns. So now it's on you to figure out what's happening and to prove your claims of royalty are legitimate. Again, the story's just kind of there. A bit of mythology and religion, a dash of political intrigue, some fantastical creatures on the loose. It's been done before to greater effect in other RPGs. It does feel really weird basically having how do I put this without YouTube's algorithm getting mad at me? Indentured servants who go along with whatever you put them through. And everyone in the game's uncomfortably cool with it too, but fine, the narrative is just a framework for the gameplay to work within. Probably best not to dwell on it too much. So, the game begins at the character creation screen, where you make your own character and your main pawn who sticks around permanently by your side. And the options here get very, very granular. So much so that Capcom released the character creator as a standalone download before the full game was released, so people could take their time making who they want and import them to the full game later. Which, of course, led to memes. Turns out people on the internet are really good at recreating stuff from pop culture when they're given the right tools. I tried a couple of dumb things myself, like Shrek, whose head shape I couldn't change so he just looks horrifying, and Keanu Reeves with cheekbones that wouldn't cooperate. In the end, I settled on taking it a little bit more seriously and tried to make myself. And besides the bug eyes and the mismatched hair, I don't think I did too bad. Probably could have made my proportions more flattering, but hey, I am a pretty big, awkwardly shaped guy after all. I grabbed a staff and started the game as a spell-slinging mage. I didn't really have a plan for my main pawn. I mean, originally it would have been Puss in Boots to go with my Shrek, naturally. So I just kinda roleplayed it. If I was going to become the chosen one of the story, I'd need a tough bodyguard to protect my sorry ass and keep me motivated when the world tries to keep me down. Someone with combat experience, a chiseled jawline, and a can-do attitude. And so, Shifu, the roguish master of the dual daggers, was born. With my first steps into the world of Dragon's Dogma II, I found that the game's appearance and audio walk a very fine line between stunning and absolute jankiness. It leans pretty hard into a realistic look, so there's not a very eye-catching or distinct style to hook you in. The design of the landscape isn't very outlandish compared to our own, and the color palette is pretty muted for a fantasy setting. But don't mistake that for me saying that the game looks bad, because it's quite the contrary. Sometimes I'd be downright awestruck by the sunrise cresting over a mountain range, or a roaring waterfall tucked into the face of a secluded cliff, or a lone tower overlooking the land which stretches out into the horizon. The picturesque moments like these were punctuated by spectacular fights and exciting new discoveries, like weapons or collectibles. It made taking out my map and seeing an entirely unexplored location a welcome sight. The environments are dense with foliage and a staggering amount of enemies. The opening zone is a heavily forested area outside the capital city where you'll be spending at least 10 to 15 hours completing quests and vanquishing said enemies. If you only follow the main roads, you'll notice that they're often blocked off by damaged bridges or rock slides, meaning you'll have to detour off the beaten path to reach your destinations. And the map is littered with hidden pathways and loot just begging to be found. This really made me appreciate the map's design and the way these locations were built by hand to inspire exploring more of the wilderness. I can't get enough of stuff like stumbling across a hole in the ground, which leads to a labyrinthian cave system which has a secret boss monster to fight and several different exits to the surface. However, combing over the same areas more than a few times starts to sour the experience. The game asks you to make your way across zones several times over for different quests, and since you never obtain a mount like a horse and the fast travel system is extremely limited, running around everywhere starts to feel draining. Especially if you already spent time searching for all the cool surprises in the area the first time around. After about my 30th trek across Vermund, I finally reached the second major area, a red-painted desert called Batal that's home to the Beastren. Even though I had already been playing around 20 hours and still felt underleveled for the new enemies, I realized just how sorely needed the change of scenery was. And I guess I should talk about how the rest of the game looks too. The big hulking monsters are awesome. The player characters and pawns look as good as they've been made to look, but most of the NPCs and quest givers could probably use a light touch-up. A lot of them look like Skyrim-era characters, with poor lip sync and strange features to boot. Especially the children. Jesus Christ, why are some of their faces so terrifying? It doesn't help that the camera doesn't know what to do when you start a conversation with people either. You can't even frame both participants in the same shot half the time, and that just frustrates me at no end. And if you're sensitive to low or uneven frame rates, this game might just drive you up a wall too. The performance normally rests around a base of 30 FPS on console, but the frame rate is uncapped. This means that in practice, it hovers anywhere from around a maximum of 45 down to the low teens in heavily populated areas. And let me tell you, the capital city of Vermund, Vernworth, where you're going to spend a massive amount of time, it stutters uncontrollably. Like, it is completely unacceptable. The game should have never shipped with these problems. The music isn't particularly memorable, though there is some neat diegetic music that NPCs will play on instruments when you get near them, and the sound effects across the game are just fine, I guess. Some things like flying creatures have a tendency to sound way closer or further away than they actually are though, which is distracting. I do also have to mention that some of the recordings for voices don't hit the mark of quality that they should. For the main character in Pawns at least, it's pretty clear that they only hired like 4 voice actors total, and all of the options in between are just the same performances pitch shifted up or down a couple of octaves. The voice acting itself is, again, fine. Everyone's talking with goofy, exaggerated accents that might make you cringe a little bit, but some of the lines sound like they definitely got compressed too much or shifted beyond what sounds natural for the actor or actress. And those aren't the only signs of cost-cutting procedures that took place during development either. One of the most bizarre things is that there's no actual cooking animation. They just had someone on their team buy some steaks and literally filmed B-roll of it cooking in a pan. Like, it never stops being weird, setting up camp, choosing a dish, and then seeing this single instance of real-life footage come out of nowhere. But yeah, okay, it doesn't actually affect the gameplay, and it's kind of a funny, clever way to save money, which could get invested elsewhere in the pipeline. So let's get to the real meat of Dragon's Dogma 2 and talk about the main course, gameplay. But hey, before I season the pan, how about you hit that like button for me and maybe subscribe while you're at it. Help me show YouTube that my video producing skills are just as tasteful as my honey-glazed puns. Like most RPGs, when you create a character, you get to choose a specialized role for that character to fill. Most games call them classes or jobs, this game calls them vocations. Now, in this game, you can play any vocation that you want and switch between them at will, as long as you have access to a guild hall and enough experience to unlock them. And the same goes for your pawn. There are 4 vocations to begin with, being fighter, archer, thief, and mage. 2 more are unlocked through a quest early on, being the warrior and the sorcerer, and a few more later down the road. I'll leave those for you to discover on your own. The first group of vocations play exceptionally different from one another. Thieves and archers are both very light on their feet, but of course, one focuses on melee attacks and the other favors a bow. Fighters are your standard sword and shield frontline tanks who run headlong into danger while protecting the party. And mages, the first vocation that I chose, are magic wielders with a mix of offensive and defensive options. Raining down elemental attacks on enemies while buffing and healing their allies is their core utility. I've tried all of these for a little while, and I think my favorite to play is probably the Thief, even though they're pretty squishy. You can bolt across the battlefield unbelievably fast, and whip out moves that look super flashy while tearing apart enemies. My least favorite was probably the Archer, partly because they use special types of arrows for most of their good attacks that just aren't basic shots, and I have hang-ups about needing to keep resources in my inventory to craft special arrows. But also because it doesn't feel like they're properly scaled to do the same amount of damage as the other classes. I don't know for sure, maybe it's just my bias from a bad experience the head showing. Either way, you'll definitely hear about that soon. Anyways, after the first few hours, I ended up eventually falling in love with the warrior vocation. It's completely offense-based with a big, slow, two-handed weapon, and it also gets a giant bump in health and defenses when you charge up your swings. You get super armor that almost completely prevents you from flinching while in charging animations, and somehow it also does like 4 times the amount of damage as any other vocation. So yeah, an easy choice for me. Bunga bunga, monkey brain likey, big damage. Of course, you aren't alone on this journey. Each of your pawns gets a vocation as well, but I think they're locked to the first 6 choices that I mentioned, making the final 4 you find unique to the Arisen. Obviously, you choose what your main pawn is going to be, but the other 2 slots in your party are to be filled with pawns hired from the Rift, or hanging out in the overworld that you run into. Their vocations are set in stone, either by Capcom themselves, or the players online who created them. It makes for a really interesting cooperative multiplayer experience, where you're not directly playing with others, but their choices can still impact your own experience. You'll probably want to retain some kind of balance when putting together your team to be effective in combat, and each person's pawn will have different loadouts of attacks and spells, meaning that almost no 2 are the same. A general rule of thumb is that the higher level pawns with stronger loadouts have a Rift Crystal cost associated with hiring them, while the more basic ones can be coerced to join you for free. Side note, Rift Crystals are a form of in-game currency that you can find pretty often while exploring the world. Now, while your main pawn sticks around and levels up alongside you, the last 2 pawn slots do not. They're a rotating cast, and it's good practice to scout out your options and change your makeup of your party every few levels. Especially if you want to change up your own vocation to try something new, as you should be doing fairly often. Sure, you can just stick to one, but you'd be limiting your own potential. See, as your character levels up, they accrue passive buffs called augments, depending on whichever vocation that you're playing as. And if you swap vocations, you can keep using those augments on your new selection. Even if you're really attached to one specific playstyle, I would strongly recommend taking on at least a second role, if only for this reason. The pawn system is one of the most unique mechanics this game has to offer, as not only are you building a team of your own would-be MMO characters, but you're also getting the inherent experience they gained from traveling with their original player. So, what do I mean by that? Well, pawns are constantly talking, always chattering, always giving advice. Sometimes far too much than I honestly wish they would. But the idea is that when a player has a pawn in their party, that pawn starts to build a base of knowledge about some parts of the world and the questlines they've seen completed. So when they go through the rift and they enter your parallel version of reality, they can say, "Oh, my master found a chest over here," or "Strange, that person died when my master tried doing things differently." Sometimes these sparks are helpful, sometimes they're extremely repetitive and annoying. For God's sake, yes, I know there's a ladder. I've climbed it a dozen times, just to shut you up.
Mayhap this ladder is here for a reason.
Perhaps new discoveries await us above.
But more often than not, they're just adding some funny charm to your adventure that would otherwise be dead air. They also try to high five or fist bump you at the end of a fight, which feels like the equivalent of Fortnite default dancing on their corpses. I like it. Early on your journey, you and the squad are going to be fighting a lot of the same enemies back to back. Some goblins, some harpies, some lizard people called saurians, you get the point. Everywhere you go is littered with these minor threats. But the shining stars of the show are the larger monsters that'll put you on high alert. Sometimes you'll be out casually exploring and stumble into them, like in the case of the Minotaur or the Cyclops. Other times you'll be minding your own business, running down a road, and a fucking griffin will swoop down from the heavens to ruin your day. Speaking from experience. These guys and some of the goofy physics in the game create a sense of emergent gameplay that you don't see much of in the RPG space. And when you're fighting them, you can climb up their bodies Shadow of the Colossus style to jab them in their weak points. This is a two-way street though. If you're not careful, they can grab you and toss you like a ragdoll.
A measure of pace does not go amiss.
It seems we have enraged our foe.
While you can spot most of these enemies with the naked eye during the day, staying outside at night with no protection and a weakened team almost always leads to a death sentence. If you decide to go out unprepared for a quick task and get caught off guard by a chimera or a spectral Dullahan knight lurking in the shadows, you really only have two options: run for your life or die in excruciating pain. Earlier, I teased that I had a story of my own, so yeah, the first time I tried out the archer vocation, I was entering a brand new area. I know, what a terrible day to have eyes. I'm a function over form kind of guy, and this fit gave me the best stats. You got a problem with it?
Too bad.
Anyways, I was about to deal with a bandit camp before I spotted a massive shadow moving across the ground. So I look up and see a griffin coming in hot. It drops in to say hello, and my team then spends all day trying to clean its clock. During the fight, my team needs to be revived about a dozen times before the griffin eventually decides it doesn't want to play with us anymore, by which point the night has veiled the area in pitch blackness and skeletons have started to rise from the ground. Left with no other choice, I cut my losses and abandoned my dying pawns to find a place to rest. Something that I haven't mentioned yet is that if you don't find a place to sleep, your team's health bars begin to shrink with sections that can't be healed through normal means. After beelining to the nearest settlement, I finally rest at an inn and decide to expend a fairy stone to fast travel back to Vernworth, where I can touch the rift stone to get my party back. And keep in mind, those fairy stones are pretty expensive and hard to come by at this stage of the game. I land back in town, take a moment to glance at my phone, and then I get assailed by saurians. This is how I learned the lesson that cities are not safe from enemy attacks. Luckily, there were enough armed NPCs around for me to pick off the lizards one at a time, and finally put a new group together. The next day, I changed to fighter, and guess who's back for round 2? After a couple of minutes, it gets bored and flies off again. The next day, I'm relieved to finally be making some progress, just killing some goblins, and wait, does anyone else hear boss music? By this point, I'm already pretty upset. The griffin escapes again, but my blood is boiling at this stupid, time-wasting bird, and I take it personally. This feathery bastard carries me halfway across the desert to a plateau in the middle of nowhere, waits until I run out of stamina, and leaves me stranded before strutting off into the sunset. I'm exhausted. The team is exhausted. Darkness has fallen so you can't see more than 5 feet in front of your face, and everyone starts falling off of cliffs as we try to find our way down. When I finally reach the bottom, hordes of bandits, wolves, skeletons, and 2 armored cyclops are waiting for me. I've had it. It's every man for himself. I bob and weave like Muhammad Ali, gorge myself on stamina food, and limp back to a safe position where I kiss another fairy stone goodbye. All of this happened over the span of about 2 hours of gameplay. I wanted to throw my system in the trash when it first happened, but looking back at it all now, it was hilarious. It was like I was a cartoon character stepping on a bunch of rakes. None of it was scripted, it all just happened because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if I had taken the time to get some extra levels for some stat boosts, or upgrade my armor and weapons, or had used vocations I'd already unlocked abilities on, I probably would have had the damage to knock that griffin out the first time it showed up. And this kind of had-to-be-there gameplay carries over into the quest system as well. There aren't NPCs with big glowing exclamation points over their heads ready to send you to your next objective. Most of the time, a stranger will just run up to you and ask you for your help, or you'll happen across someone being attacked out in the wild. Other times, you won't even know there's a quest available unless you engage in conversation with a random person. And a lot of the quests need to be completed in a timely manner. The game serves you a warning about not taking on too many tasks at once because you may miss your window of opportunity to complete ones that are urgent. For example, in a small checkpoint town, a shopkeeper tells you that his grandson was dragged away by a pack of wolves. After questioning the locals, they give you more information to work with. He was tending a garden of moonglow flowers on the edge of town near a cenotaph before the wolves chased him down. Well, if you start your search during the day, you'll probably find some patches of flowers that the townfolk mention, but not a lot more to go off of, unless one of your pawns already has completed the quest in their own world. But the thing about moonglow flowers is that they glow bright blue in the moonlight, and this kid accidentally dropped some of their petals to form a path leading to a cave, like Hansel and Gretel dropping breadcrumbs. Unfortunately, it's now nighttime, which means you're more likely to run into more deadly enemies. If you don't die along the way and work fast enough to reach the cave, you can fight off the wolves and escort him back home safely. But if you take too long to find the path and the sun starts to come up, that kid will die and you will have failed the quest. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about friction. Friction is important when it comes to game design, and I'm talking about the concept of friction, not literal friction. Though that's probably important too. How much friction do you put between your players and their objectives? Too little and the game feels meaningless and dull. Too much and it becomes a frustrating slog. And this doesn't necessarily correlate with the difficulty of the game. Basic quality of life features can add or subtract friction from the equation. A lot of people will bounce off of Dragon's Dogma II because of the amount of friction it has. Between the impractical questing, the lack of a lock-on function in combat, the sheer amount of item management and the encumbered system that comes with it, Starfield says hello, the need to find campsites or an inn to rest at to fully recover your party's health. These can all be major turnoffs in their own way. But nothing incurs more friction than the way you have to get from point A to point B. I already spoke of the disdain I have for needing to run everywhere and the lack of any mobility improvements, but that's only speaking to part of the problem. Fast travel is a thing, but it practically may as well not exist until you've explored about half of the world. The alternative they present is ox carts, which will take you from very specific points on the map to other very specific points. Sure, that could work, but they only begin their routes at the earliest point in the day. And they have set destinations, so you can't choose where they go. And then they can be attacked in the middle of their route, so you have to defend them. And of course, their destinations are so spread out that it makes me wonder what the point even is. By the time I've gone to an inn to rest, ran all the way over to an ox cart, waited for the driver to hop on, defended it from an attack in the middle of the route, and waited through the load screens, I literally could have just walked and been there 3/4 of the way. And that's if the ox cart doesn't get destroyed in the process, leaving you stranded miles away from your destination. So the obvious solution, fast travel, also has to be obnoxious. You have to travel to a certain crystal, of which there are very few. I mean, I've only seen 2 in my entire run, one in the capital city and one in some place called Harv for some reason. The saving grace is that you can get additional crystals as quest rewards, which can be dropped on the ground anywhere you want, creating your own network. You know how many of those I've gotten? 1. And they aren't even free to use. You still need to use a consumable item called a fairy stone to travel to the crystals, and outside of spending 10,000 gold for one at a shop, you might find one every 5 to 6 hours or so. Look, I get that the world is basically the main character of the game, and as developers, you really want people to explore the world you've built for them. But why do you feel like you need to force them to do it multiple times? Don't you think they would backtrack if they actually wanted to? All this does is pad out the game and waste the player's time. It's unnecessary friction. And the cynical part of me can't help but feel that it's Capcom's way of trying to push microtransactions. Yes, we need to talk about it. They created the problem to sell players a solution. And this makes me think, why should we trust that a system like fast travel hasn't been tampered with and made more annoying on purpose? They're putting items that make those systems easier to interact with behind a paywall, so clearly they're valuable. Otherwise, you would have no reason to spend real money for them. I don't think people reacting negatively or avoiding the game altogether because of the included microtransactions is unwarranted behavior. Being able to earn some of the items in-game is not a defense. This actively makes the game worse for the people who already paid a full $70 price tag for entry. I don't want to misattribute the words to the wrong person, but I still remember content creators saying something over a decade ago. No microtransaction is optional because I cannot pay for a version of the game which doesn't include microtransactions. It sucks because otherwise this is a fantastic game. I can definitely see myself playing through the whole thing and beating it as soon as I'm done beating Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But I have to put a big asterisk next to my recommendation of this game because Capcom got greedy and created controversy. So here are my final thoughts. If anything I said before the last couple of minutes sounds fun to you, borrow the game from a friend. Rent the game. Surprisingly enough, your local library may have a copy. Or if you really feel drawn to it, then buy it. I did, and I really do think it's worth a shot for any fantasy or action RPG enjoyer looking for something that immerses you deeply into its world. But please, don't interact with the microtransactions. Show Capcom that we don't want them, but that including them in the future can have a negative impact on their bottom line. Because that is all that the people at the top care about. They're already in Resident Evil. Don't be surprised if they show up next in Monster Hunter Wilds. Sorry for the hard tangent at the end of the video. I really hate finishing on a sour note. You know what? Revenge is sweet. See you guys again soon. Bye.